Good evening.
Good evening.
Blessing of the Lord be upon you.
We bless you in the name of the Lord.
Thank you. Tonight we're going to talk about a man by the name of Mordecai. And since we've been studying about the intertestamental period of history, getting ready to talk about the reign of Xerxes, hopefully next Lord's Day for our Bible class we'll talk about Darius, one Histapes, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Xerxes. Xerxes is the emperor of the Persian Empire, the king at the time of Esther and Mordecai. And the book is called the Book of Esther. I don't know why. It's more about Mordecai than it is really about Esther. Of course, Esther is a primary character in it, but Mordecai seems to be the inspiring figure here. Great people are often overshadowed by figures who simply stand out a little bit more. And the Book of Esther, again, should probably be called the Book of Mordecai, for it was her cousin who stood behind her and with her and encouraged her to have the faith to do the right thing. So we want to look at the life of Mordecai. That doesn't take anything away from Esther, or Hadassah is her name in the Hebrew. Just a brief history that we have here. The setting of the Book of Esther is prior to Ezra and Nehemiah's arrivals in Jerusalem. That would be for the reading of the law, establishing the law, Ezra being a priest and a scribe, and Nehemiah, who was the cupbearer for the next king, Artaxerxes, who comes to rebuild the walls. Ahasuerus was the king over the great Medo-Persian Empire, which by virtue of defeating the Babylonians had inherited many things, including the captive Israelites. So in Esther chapter 1, we find that Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, had a family and administrative crisis. Vashti, his queen, disobeyed his command. Remember what it was from the story. He was having a party, a big feast, and if we would really look into history, he was probably having an orgy. Xerxes is not a very moral, ethical person. He did a lot of good things, but he was corrupt like so many powerful leaders can be. So he calls for his queen Vashti to come to the party, but she doesn't want to appear. She doesn't want to come there, and it's probably because she doesn't want to come there naked. So she refuses. So what's going to happen? Vashti, the queen, has disobeyed the king's command. So after discussion with his advisors, she's disobeyed you. You can't have that because you are the king. Vashti was put away or divorced, and a new queen was to be chosen. That was the decision that was made. So in chapter 2, a decree goes out to every corner of the empire to bring the loveliest young women to the capital, that a new queen could be chosen. And this is where we are introduced then to Mordecai and Esther. We learn that Mordecai was a man who lived true religion, and his religion, of course, he was a Jew, but he worshiped Yahweh. And he did his very best in those troubling times to worship according to the law of Moses. Now, he was one of the Jews who did not go back to Judea and Jerusalem. He could have gone back at the time of, if he lived at the time of Cyrus's decree, he could have gone back at a couple different times, but he didn't, which tells us that he was probably a powerful man, a man who was able to have probably a business and make friends and have business associations within the pagan community. But we go to Esther chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, or capital, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, we'll use the English pronunciations there, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, from Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. Oh, that wasn't Mordecai, that was his grandfather probably, all right? So he was bringing up Hadassah. And Hadassah, who did I tell you that was?
Esther.
That's Esther, all right? That is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, and that's a bad translation there. Well, yeah, daughter of his uncle, I'm sorry. Lots of places you read, they'll say that he was Esther's uncle. He's cousin to Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Okay, so what does that tell you? James 1:27 calls that pure and undefiled religion before God, right? You take care of the widows and the orphans, the fatherless. So he took her, raised her, and tried to do what was right for her. In verses 8 and 9 of Esther chapter 2. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. Hegai, in charge of the harem, so to speak. Anyway, the young woman talking about Esther, pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of the food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. In other words, of all these women, young women that were brought in, he sees her as somebody special. So he gives her what she needs to enhance her beauty, so to speak, gives her portions of food, more so than these others, and also takes women, young women from the palace who understand what you need to know and what you need to do to be around the king. In other words, to instruct her. This is what palace life is like. And so she would understand. So Mordecai, again, was probably a successful businessman who chose to remain in Persia. His connections in the community would permit him to sponsor Esther in this endeavor. And this is pointed out later, when Mordecai's sitting at the gate, the men who sat at the gates of the city were considered the elders of the city, and they could make certain judgments. And it was only the tough cases that the king would have to deal with. So he was a wise man, instructing Esther not to reveal her ethnicity. That's in Esther chapter 2, verse 10 and verse 20. Don't tell them you are a Judean. Just don't tell them that. For whatever reason, and it might be simply that she's not a native-born person. She's not of Persia. She's not of Media. She's from way over there. Well, remember what we talked about this morning with the letter that was written to Artaxerxes, and I call him Artaxerxes X, beyond the river, the province beyond the river, the outcasts, the ones there in the backwaters. Don't let them know that that's where you're from. Verse 11, and every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So this shows that he had access to the palace and to officials in the palace. So he was somebody of some type of power, relationships, that he could do this. And in that sense, that's why he could sponsor Esther. Verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the women. That's all those women that were brought that he could get to choose a queen from. And she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Well, then Mordecai discovered a plot to assassinate the king and made it known through Esther. Now, what do we call this? We call this the providence of God, don't we? You see God's hand working through this. In Esther chapter 2, verse 21 and 22, in those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, what do we say? That's a position where you must be somebody of power and substance to be able to sit there. Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes. They were going to assassinate him. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. And he told Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. She says, hey, Mordecai told me these two guys are going to assassinate you, or planning to assassinate you. So Xerxes able to take care of that problem before any damage is done. So the fruit of his righteous act was not rewarded immediately. In other words, these two guys, Bigthan and Teresh, they're killed or hanged or whatever, but Mordecai isn't rewarded. It's kind of like he gets forgotten about. Kind of like Joseph, when the butler and the baker, remember he interprets the dreams, and the butler, cupbearer, forgets about Joseph. But later, the king would be made aware of it, and the lives of many of God's people would be spared. Later on, the king, he can't sleep one night, so he's going through the books, right? Reading the books. The books are opened. Well, that's what the king's supposed to do. He's supposed to know what happened in the past, what's going on now, so he can make right decisions for the future. But the plot's destroyed because of Mordecai. After the failed coup, the king promoted a man by the name of Haman the Agagite to second in the kingdom. And it's kind of like a viceroy or a advisor, may as well say an advisor, the chief advisor. But Mordecai refused to bow before Haman. For whatever reason there was, Mordecai refused. He wasn't going to bow down to him. And that's in Esther chapter 3, verses 2 through 6. Well, Proverbs 24, verses 24 and 25 tells us, or indicates it's wrong to give honor to the wicked. So, Mordecai, well, let me drop back just a little bit. Haman probably was one of the men who would sit at the gate, along with Mordecai. And Mordecai probably knew and understood what type of a person that Haman was. Another thing from a historical sense of this, some of the commentators will tell you that Haman, being an Agagite, had a ancestral hatred of the Jews. Because if you go back in the history of Israel, there was a king by the name of Agag, whom the Israelites came through, took his territory, and killed him. Well, Haman was an Agagite, one of the ones, a descendant of those who probably escaped that, but he didn't like the Jews, the Judeans. But Mordecai refused to bow before Haman, even though Haman's like one of the principal officers now of the kingdom. So what happens? Well, we would say that Haman was butthurt, right? Well, hurt feelings at the hand of Mordecai, and that led him to a hatred of all the Jews. Now, you hate one person, you hate everybody associated with him. It's just, sometimes human beings do that for whatever reason. So Haman used his access to the king to gain a decree to put all the Jews to death. He kind of tricked the king into this. Hey, you know, here's some bad people. And remember, we talked this morning about how that Artaxerxes, belonging back in that period, probably right at the end of the reign of Cambyses, or right at the start of the reign of Darius, he probably didn't care very much for the Jews, whether they existed or not. He actually made the decree, you know, you got to stop work on the temple, got to quit. And so down through history, there are just times when there were people who didn't like what was going on and wanted to stop the work. But what was the excuse that they would use? Well, the same thing as with what they said to Artaxerxes. These people will rebel against you if you let them. And probably here Haman is saying, if he won't bow down to me, he probably won't bow down to you. If he doesn't respect me, he probably won't respect you. And if he's like that, guess what? All those people are going to be like that, and eventually they're going to rise up. And you know what? What happened to Pharaoh down in Egypt about 1,000 years ago? Makes you think, right? So, verse 8 of Esther chapter 3 down through verse 11. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay, listen to this, I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries. I'll give you 10,000. You'll let me destroy these people. I don't know how much that was worth, but it had to be worth a lot of money. I'll pay you to let me kill these people, destroy these people. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. So the king is saying, you're giving me 10,000 talents of silver for this decree, and I'm giving that back to you, plus all the soldiers, will say, that you need to go do that. Boom, there's the signet ring. That's the power, right? That was like the seal that they would use. So anywhere Haman would go to buy stuff, to make contracts, to do this, there it is. It's with the king's approval. So against the threat of Mordecai, or against this threat, Mordecai was courageous, trusting God to protect the Jews. In chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. That's what the Jews did, right? Or that's what at least people in the ancient Near East did when they were sorrowful and mournful, and went out into the midst of the city. Now that was a mistake, wasn't it? And he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate. What's wrong with that? For no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. Hey, you got troubles? You keep them at home. Don't bring your troubles to the king's palace. Get out of here. What? No peaceful protests here. Not going to have it. But you see what he does? He goes to where the problem can be solved. He didn't run from it. He ran to the strength of the opposition. So what does he do? Well, who's there? Who's at the palace? Well, Esther is. And Mordecai encouraged Esther to also trust God and approach the king. Esther chapter 4, verse 14 through 16. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. What's he saying? God's got a plan. You can be part of that plan. And if not, if you don't want to be a part of it, it's okay. God will work through somebody else. That's what we say. If Judas had not betrayed Jesus, somebody else would have. Because God said, it's going to happen. But you and your father's house will perish. Because when it says it's her father's house, of course, her father's dead. But what happens? That lineage is gone. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. That's what we hear. That's the big thing, isn't it? But who says that? It's Mordecai, isn't it? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, or he actually asked somebody to take this message to her. Then she tells them, go, tell Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king. Though it is against the law, boy, they're just lawbreakers, aren't they? He comes to the gate in sackcloth, and she's going to go to the king. And that's what got Vashti put away, isn't it? But look what it says. If I perish, I perish. Remember what we talked about? I talked about this morning in the sermon. Jesus was uncompromising. He knew there was a task that he had to do. And he did it. She's saying, this is something I need to do. I'm going to do it. We can go back through the history of Israel. There are times, and particularly in the time of the Judges, in the year-long reading of the Bible, read the Bible through in a year that I'm doing, in the book of Judges right now, and there are times it's like, God is calling someone to do something. They got to do it. God told Israel in the book of Joshua, what did he tell them? I'm giving you this land. Go in and take it. I'm giving it to you. Go in and take it. We don't get God's gifts by sitting around doing nothing. We have to get them. Mordecai encouraged Esther to trust in God and approach the king. And she did. She did. In chapter 5, we learned of Esther's plan to use Haman's pride for his destruction. And that's a biblical principle, isn't it? Pride goes before a fall, right? So, hey, what do you use for a person, that's prideful? Use their pride to bring them down. She approached King Ahasuerus and invited him and Haman to a feast the next day. Now, when you go through the story and you read it, there's like 2 or 3 days that this is going on, and there's discussion going on between Haman and his wife and their friends and such, and it's just like he's kind of confused, and then it's like, but I'm being asked, and it's just going to be Queen Esther and the king and me at the feast. Wow, isn't that great? That's the pride issue there, isn't it? Look at verses 12 through 14. Then Haman said, even Queen Esther let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. That's like one day. And then tomorrow also I'm invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. In other words, when I go back to that feast, there's going to be that Mordecai sitting there, and he won't bow down to me like all those other men there at the gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made. You know what that's 75 feet tall. And in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. Of course, he's got the signet ring. He can get the materials and he can get the workmen, and in a night's time, he can have those gallows made. But the providence of God was working in a different direction. In chapter 6, King Ahasuerus discovers Mordecai has not been rewarded. This is where he's up all night. It's the night between the 2 days of this feast. Catch that? Something's on his mind. Something's bothering him, and he just can't sleep. So he's going to go read. Hey, I read, I go to sleep. I know what that's like. The king asks Haman when he comes in the next day, when Haman's supposed to be saying, I got this gallows built, and I want to hang Mordecai. King asks him something first. Says, what should be done for one who should be honored? Thinking the honor is for himself, Haman suggests a parade. A parade and public proclamations. Yeah, have a parade, and the person out ahead of the parade, somebody alongside yelling, this is what the king does for someone who does a favor for the king. Something like that, make everybody in town know. So imagine how he felt learning that it was Mordecai who was going to be honored, and he was going to be the one who had to give the public praises. Esther chapter 6 and verse 12. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. This is after the parade. Uh-oh. What happens? His pride has brought him down. When Haman came to Esther's banquet in chapter 7, he might have thought, well, everything's okay, seeing the feast goes into that second day. But when Queen Esther pleaded the cause of her people before King Ahasuerus and revealed that Haman was behind this insidious plot, Haman falls apart. It's like, oh no, I'm caught. Look at verses 5 through 8 of chapter 7. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he who has dared to do this? Make this plan to kill all the Jews?" And Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And the king rose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther. That sounds like a proud man, doesn't it? He's begging. Now, okay, and I don't mean to make light of this, but now he's begging from a Jew. He's bowing down to a Jew. The one who a Jew would not bow down to, and it made him angry. You see that? For he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. That didn't look good, did it? And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" Esther chapter 7, verse 10. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. When the king learned the truth, even as morally corrupt as what that king was, his wrath at such a terrible thing was an honest wrath. Does that make sense? Morally correct for a person to want to commit a genocide? Terrible. But once that happened, the wrath of the king was abated. Of course, that wasn't the end of the story, was it? Mordecai was then promoted to second in the kingdom. Esther chapter 8, verses 1 through 6. By law, the king's commandment to kill the Jews could not be rescinded. That's one of the big things that they come up with. Once there's a law made, the law has to be carried out. But another decree was made giving the Jews the right to defend themselves. Excuse me. That's Esther chapter 8, verses 7 through 14. Well, I can't rescind this law, but I can make another law that they can defend themselves. Esther chapter 9, verse 1. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, at the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. And Esther chapter 9, verse 20 through 32 tells the institution of the Feast of Purim. You can ask my wife about that. She can tell you all about it. She watches the videos. Which has been observed by the descendants of the Jews to this day. Now, that's in that passage, but to this day, today they still celebrate the Feast of Purim. Esther chapter 10 second part of verse 2 and into verse 3. The full account of the high honor of Mordecai to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus. In other words, he took Haman's place. And he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. That's why I say, this book probably should have been called the Book of Mordecai. What a great man to stand up, but to encourage someone else to do what they needed to do to save a people and to carry on God's plan for bringing Messiah into the world. Well, that's our lesson for tonight. I think that goes hand in hand with the lessons from the intertestamental period. It's also an encouraging lesson for each and every one of us, especially for the times that we are in our nation. So continue to pray for our nation. Continue to pray things get better rather than things get worse. But thank you for your time and your attention. The lesson is yours.